And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that the world should be taxed, and all went to be taxed, every one to his own city. That was an early government census, a collection of data necessary for the financing of legions and the building of aqueducts. But what happens in the infinitely more complex modern world if your data collection becomes untrustworthy? Because it seems that we may be in that situation here and now, particularly in the area of economic statistics. Some even talk of a data crisis. Are we in such a crisis? If we are, how worried should we be? And what should we do about it? Step into the briefing room and together we'll find out. First, let's look at the history of data collection in the UK. Georgina Sturge is a research affiliate at the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford and the author of the book Some of Us, that's some as in S-U-M. Georgina Sturge, when did we first start to systematically collect data in the UK? And should we start with Doomsday Book, or is it later?
Well, I would start later, and I'd say that the first systematic data collection really began at the very beginning of the 19th century. So I really like to mark it with the 1801 census, the very first census that we had. And before that, there were some fairly sporadic data collection efforts, including the Doomsday Book that you just mentioned. Some people think of that as a kind of early census in 1086. It wasn't really a census of people as such. It was more of a census of assets that was taken by the Normans who wanted to see what they'd just kind of got their hands on. And famously, the Doomsday Book includes more records of pigs than of women. But it wasn't until 1801 that we had that first attempt at a census, and that was fairly revolutionary actually. Before that, there had actually been quite a bit of fear about doing censuses actually, and it wasn't really until we realized that the French had started doing censuses that we decided that we needed to kind of get on this new technology ourselves.
So I imagine it was fairly basic at the beginning. When did the information that they were gathering start to grow a bit more rich?
Yeah, so those first censuses between 1801 and 1841, that was kind of an experimental phase. Something changed in the mid-19th century, which was that we went from having censuses where we recorded information at the household level to recording individual information. So like the censuses that we do now, they started to record information about every single person living in a household. So that was their name, gender, what they did, some other basic information about them. And that really changed the kind of statistics that we collected, the kind of data that we had on file, because that gave us this incredibly rich image of the population that we just hadn't had before. And some really interesting things kind of came out of the woodwork that the statisticians hadn't been expecting. So they didn't really have any information on what women were doing in terms of employment until they started collecting that individual level data. And they discovered things like 3/4 of the people employed in domestic service were women. And women were also the majority in some manufacturing occupations as well, and that a lot of children were working, for example, which was kind of an open secret, but the statistics actually gave some weight to arguments about it and ultimately campaigns to improve conditions.
So are you saying that at that point, when the data was released, it actually helped people change government policy or create government policy because of the new information they had?
Absolutely. And that was one of the purposes of this whole new world of systematically collecting data. It was a time of an increasing emphasis on the idea of governments being democratically elected, representative of the people, accountable to the people. And so collecting statistics were part of that. Governments wanted to be seen to kind of use evidence on what was going on and respond to it with policy. The information that started to emerge about living conditions and poverty actually came more through private research projects that started to be done in the later 19th century. And so you have people like Charles Booth, who some people might have heard of. He was a kind of social research pioneer and just generally a kind of rich philanthropist who took it on himself to conduct this huge survey, basically, of poverty in London and living conditions. And there was another person called Seaborn Rowntree who did the same thing in York a bit later on. And both of them, what they did was a census-like exercise of getting enumerators to go house to house and interview people, but in a bit more depth than a census. So to really get them talking about what their income sources were, what their kind of expenditure was, and to find out information about things like ailments that they had. And through that, they were able to build up a richer kind of impression of what was really keeping people in poverty. And discoveries like that did, in the end, lead to the creation of the welfare state.
At what point did government move beyond the national census and start surveying in other ways and at other times?
So that would have been around the 1960s, I would say, is when another kind of industry of social surveying took off. And the idea is that they don't survey the entire population like a census does. They'll just take a sample, and providing it's representative, that will give the statisticians an idea of what's going on in the population as a whole. So then you had things like the labour force survey, there's an annual population survey, family resources survey. These kind of things came in to find out a bit more about what households were actually doing, what their budgets were like, and so on.
Can we say about that period that people actually were pretty good at replying to surveys, that they saw it, I don't know, maybe as part of a civic duty or something like that?
Definitely. Part of it was still this post-war, wartime mentality of complying with instructions that were given to you by the authorities. There was a sense that this was something that one did for the public good. So the response rates were pretty high. The compliance rates were very high.
So that points to almost a kind of a golden era of the survey around about the 70s and 80s.
Definitely. And you have to remember this was during the Cold War. And I think we think of ourselves as having been the kind of the liberal party in the Cold War, obviously, the West, the democracies. But there was still a very heavy emphasis on compliance and also on information. So this was really a time when the British state was just consolidating a lot more information than it had ever had.
Georgina Sturge. Now on to how we collect our stats today and who does it. Professor Denise Leavesley is former principal of Green Templeton College, Oxford, and the author of a 2023 independent review into the UK statistical system. Denise Leavesley, can we talk about how the Office for National Statistics actually collects data, starting with survey data? If I'm asked to take part, what happens? Do I get a letter? Do I get an email? What?
You'd normally get a letter first, but you might then provide the information, usually with an interviewer, but sometimes in the past, by post, by telephone, or sometimes online. Interviewers will visit individual people who've been selected to take part and interview them in their homes.
And how long are these surveys? Are they user-friendly? I imagine they're tested.
They are tested. There's a lot of piloting takes place in order to establish that the length of time is acceptable to the population being surveyed. The surveys vary in length, but of course there's always a resource issue and there's always pressure upon government statisticians to add more questions rather than doing a survey from scratch. And as a result, we get some surveys that are a bit too long, and then we suffer with response rates because you're asking them to give up quite precious time. And businesses in particular often think, you already have this information. I already give this information to HMRC or whatever.
Well, now, that's a very good point. So somebody might say, well, look, why do you need all this survey evidence when there's so many statistics collected by various things on each of us, on the NHS, the HMRC, which you've just mentioned, vehicle licensing, the Passport Office, and so on?
Really good question. And of course, in the UK, we have to collect much more information by surveys or by special special data collections because we don't have a system of a population register. We don't each have one population number. We can't link data sets. There's a certain resistance in the population to us linking data from different government departments.
Do we have anybody overseeing the collection of all statistics in various places? I mean, is there a stats czar somewhere?
There are two bodies that are of relevance to this. There is the UK Statistics Authority, which is the body, it's like the governing body for statistics, if you like, and that oversees statistics for the UK, so statistics that are collected using government money. There's also, reporting to the UK Statistics Authority, the Office for Statistics Regulation. And they are really about upholding the values of the statistical system.
So they're kind of Ofstat.
Yeah. Yes, they are.
And now to my question about the stats czar. Do we have such an office?
Yes, we have a national statistician in the UK. The national statistician is the person that provides leadership across the whole of the statistical system. So the statisticians in the Office for National Statistics report directly to the national statistician.
So who is our national statistician?
Our national statistician until relatively recently was Sir Ian Diamond. Sir Ian unfortunately resigned not so long ago, a few months ago. The post is vacant. We hope we will get a really great new national statistician.
Is it a difficult job, being national statistician?
It's a very difficult job. So, they are a permanent secretary and they have to act as a permanent secretary within the civil service. They have to understand data needs. They have to prioritise those data needs. They have to provide leadership of a professional nature. And statistics are a fairly big logistics exercise. So it's very difficult for us to get somebody who can do all of these things well.
Denise Leasley. And before we carry on, just a quick reminder that you can subscribe to the Briefing Room podcast on the BBC Sounds app, and you'll get access to the entire back catalogue, including the one about our national debt, the one about disability benefits, and the one about whether the UK can become an AI superpower. Back to stats. Let's talk now about the current crisis of confidence. What's been affected, why, and what solutions might there be? Joining me now in the briefing room are Peter Lynn, Professor of Survey Methodology at the University of Essex, and Chris Giles, economics commentator at the Financial Times. Chris Giles, let's now talk about the current data crisis. What is it, this crisis, and what's broken that once worked?
The current data crisis is really one of data quality. So we no longer can be sure that when we look at W.A.S statistics, they're actually telling us what we think they're telling us. And we have to ask, is this right? And in certain areas, it's really quite important. So anything to do with the labour market, we really have to say, well, I'm not sure that's correct. And you want to start looking at corroborating evidence rather than just taking it as a fact.
Now, can I just kind of go back to the point where you begin to think this is the case?
Well, I think we had an idea there was a problem back in the 2010s. I personally was on a expert committee on prices, and we found the retail price index to have a serious problem with it. And then the W.A.S decided it wasn't going to fix it, which I thought was extraordinary decision. That was, for me, thinking, well, where else might there be problems? Then in 2016, there was a review of economic data. It gave a reasonable bill of health to the W.A.S, but said that officials often lack curiosity at doing sense checks. Does that make sense when they got statistics? And the real problems happened in this decade where, particularly in the labour market, the surveys have deteriorated in quality to such an extent that you started having these massive revisions just because the W.A.S was weighting the surveys in different ways to before, and that really shouldn't happen in that way.
Just very briefly, Chris, what's in the labour market survey and why does it matter so much?
The labour force survey has everything you want to know about employment, unemployment, things that are happening in the regions, things that are happening to people who are born in the UK or born in other countries. And in particular, it has one thing that no other survey has, is how many people are actually seeking work and working, so participation in the labour market. You don't get that data anywhere else. At the moment, it looks like employment's rising on the official data. But if we look at payroll data, which comes from the tax authorities, how many people are working and paying tax, that looks like it's falling at the moment. And having these two data saying entirely contradictory things is obviously a problem if you have to take decisions on the basis of that. So this is really important data. Unemployment, employment, it's at the centre of economics.
And government make big decisions as a consequence of the information that they think they're getting back. What, apart from the labour force survey, has been a particular problem?
There's been a particular problem in a lot of the surveys, and it comes down to response rates. So the labour force survey used to have a response rate of about 80%. So that 80% of the people who were contacted then responded, and that's very good. In 22-23, that went down to under 20%. And this is why...
Seriously?
Yeah, absolutely seriously. So the response rate on the survey was less than 20%.
So it collapsed?
It collapsed. Another problem is the living costs and food survey, and that's used for weighting the basket of goods for inflation, so understanding what people are spending their money on. In the 1990s, again, the response rate was in the 70% range. In 22-23, it was 22%.
I'm going to ask Peter in a moment why it's happening, why that response rate has gone down. But just for a moment, if you indulge me in a metaphor, Chris. So you get the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and let's say the economy is her plane and she's trying to fly it into the airport. Isn't she in a situation now where a lot of her instruments just aren't working?
Yeah, and that's not just a small problem, that's a huge problem, because especially in the modern world where people want to be responsive to facts and say we take decisions based on the data, not just our hunches. Well, if you can't trust the data, or the data suddenly gets massively revised because something has clearly broken in one area, then they fix it, weight it differently, and then you get a completely different result. And it's not just a question of revisions. This is a question of you can't trust the numbers that are coming out. Then it makes it very hard, not only for the government to take decisions, but also for all the people who want to scrutinise government to be sure that they're making objective criticisms or compliments in either case. OK,
Peter Lynn, let's come to the why this has happened. Why are people not filling in surveys? Because that seems to be the problem, or not responding.
That's right. I mean, most of the problems that surveys have faced in the last few years stem from the fact that we have been much less successful at getting representative samples of the population to take part in surveys. And this is not a new problem. Response rates have been falling for the last 2 or 3 decades, but it has been particularly exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, which firstly made face-to-face interviewing impossible for periods of time. It decimated our field force of interviewers, most of whom sought alternative employment. And it's also changed many people's attitudes towards inviting people into their homes.
So, can you just explain to us why it is important to be able to get into the homes, why it used to be thought to be important? I mean, if you get a survey letter, something for you to fill in, you fill the thing in, you send it off. Why was it so important to have people who are able to see you face to face?
The prime reason is that in the UK, obviously we don't have a population register, so we don't have any means of selecting representative random samples of individuals where we know who each person is and can approach them personally. What we do have is a good list of addresses. It's the list of addresses that the post office delivers mail to. And that's what the labour force uses as its sampling frame. So all they have is a sample of addresses. And in order to find out who lives there and who might be eligible for the survey, you have to either visit the address or just send a letter to the occupier, because we don't have any names. And that is not very successful.
Peter, that's very interesting, because there are two elements there, what you might call systemic, the system that you use to do it, and then the cultural one, which is how people respond to whichever system it is that you use.
That's correct. I mean, the constraints imposed by not having any sample frame of individuals that can be used for most survey purposes are quite severe. They're not unique to the UK, but there are lots of countries that have the advantage of being able to sample from population registers. But the, society's reactions to being asked to take part in some kind of civil-minded activity, such as a survey, is also really important. And if the public become resistant to the idea that a survey is something for the public good that they really should take part in, that becomes a big problem. And we have to think really creatively about having to change people's mindset.
Peter, if we look at the situation across the world, are they having problems with getting survey data in other countries?
Yes. I mean, the problems that we're having in persuading people to take part in surveys are reflected in many countries of the developed world, but to different extents. The UK is probably towards the more problematic end of the spectrum, but there are several other countries that are finding it as difficult as we are. And consequently, we are sharing our knowledge about potential solutions to some of these issues with our international colleagues.
Chris, so we've had this collapse. How do you feel that the ONS and other statistical bodies in the UK have responded to the growing problem?
Well, I think they've responded initially pretty slowly. And this all came to a head in 2023 when the labour market data just collapsed to the point where the ONS felt it made no sense. There were things that were happening on a month-to-month basis, changes that could not possibly be true. And so something must be totally broken with the survey. So they suspended it for quite a while. It's come back, but now people are not very willing to trust it, I think for good reasons. But more to the point, there's been quite a lot simultaneously of other problems that have emerged in the ONS. And it does seem that the management and the culture of the organisation had taken a very bad turn, such to the point where the government set up a review this year in April into the performance and culture of the ONS. And if the Cabinet Office sets up a review into your department, you're in trouble.
I can't help noticing that the setting up of the review seems to coincide a little bit with the departure of the national statistician.
Yes, so the Cabinet Office set up a review of the ONS performance and culture in April. And then all of a sudden in May, Sir Ian Diamond, who's the national statistician, resigned because of ongoing health issues. And then in June, the review came out and it was highly, highly critical of the ONS and the culture and Sir Ian's management style. So much so that then obviously Parliament gets involved and they have select committee hearings, and the particular select committee brought in the chair of the UK Stats Authority, the interim replacement for the national statistician, and the head of the Office for Statistical Regulation, all bodies you probably never heard of, but they're all part of the oversight of the statistical system. And basically all those very senior officials put a lot of the blame on Sir Ian, to the extent that the chair of the committee, Simon Hoare, said, well, it sounds like you're saying he was some sort of hybrid of a Medici prince and Blofeld, who seemed unwilling or unable to listen to anything anybody had to say. So that was the level that everyone was blaming it on Sir Ian Diamond. It was pretty ugly, as a lot of squirming in that select committee hearing. And the committee really wanted to know, well, you're all the people who are overseeing the ONS. What were you doing? Were you asleep at the wheel? And there was a lot of squirming, and it was all very difficult. And at the end of the second hearing, the chair of the UK Statistics Authority, Sir Robert Choate, also resigned. So we had effectively a clear out of the top of the whole of the statistical system in the UK.
Right. However many people are cleared out, it still leaves us, Peter Lynn, with the question of what it is that you do about the problems which we've identified. So let's get into that section now. I mean, if I'm Rachel Reeves right now, if I was listening to this programme, and she probably knows all this, I'm saying, how am I expected to produce a budget under these circumstances? So there is some urgency here. What should we be doing?
Well, the starting point is that we need to recognise that society has become much more diverse in many relevant ways. as I've already alluded to, some people don't want to answer their door or their phone, but they might be quite willing to fill in a questionnaire online if only we knew how to communicate effectively to them why they should do so, given the constraints around the fact that we don't actually know their name, we only have their address and so on. But there are other people who are really daunted by the prospect of having to fill in something online, but might be happy to talk to a real human being to complete an interview. So the old one-size-fits-all approach to survey design is no longer effective, and we need to find ways of tailoring our approach to sample members to enable them all to participate in ways in which they find comfortable and acceptable.
The government's talking about introducing a digital ID system for the first time, which is going to require a pretty high level of information kept by government. Is there anything in that process which might assist us?
I think there's a range of things that we need to do, none of which are guaranteed to work. So as Peter said, you need to think about how you actually contact people. And I'm sure a mix and match approach, not a one size fits all, has to be part of that. I also think that some of the length of time it takes to fill in some of these government surveys is just too onerous these days, and people just refuse to do it. So the labour force survey often took about an hour to fill in. And not only that, they come once to your door and then they say, can we come 4 more times in the next 4 quarters because we want to get a sense of how things have changed for you, which is fabulous information, but not surprisingly, the response rate drops off over those 4 extra waves that they try and do it. So we might just have to accept their trade-offs where we ask fewer questions, have to accept less information just to get the real information that we absolutely need. And the final thing, which everyone always says when it comes to government, is probably some more money needs to be spent if we're serious about getting quality data. As far as the digital ID system is concerned, if that turns us from being a country that at the moment is very reluctant to part with data to government to being a country that is a little bit more willing to, a bit more Scandinavian, if you say, then I think that could be very supportive, but that's a big if.
Chris Giles there with Peter Lynn. My thanks to them, Georgina Sturge and Denise Leasley. And the Office for National Statistics has told us that the ONS is currently under new leadership, that resources are being urgently concentrated on the key economic statistics discussed, and that a new and easier to complete labour force survey is now in the field. My conclusion is, well, fill in that new survey form. It's for the good of the country. The producers were Nathan Gower, Cordelia Hemming and Kirstine Knight. The production coordinator was Maria Ogundali, the sound engineer was Duncan Hannant, and the editor was Richard Varden. Another edition of this podcast will be along again very, very soon.
As part of Limelight from BBC Radio 4, this is The Betrayed, the story of a family torn apart by a political extremism sweeping across Europe.
You see this guy in the red t-shirt?
I'd allowed myself to believe that this moment would never come.
Do you remember the looters outside the sports shop last year? The one guy who'd let his scarf slip? I think that's him.
My brother Frank, standing with a group of angry men, shouting abuse at the police.
Is it the same guy?
I now knew that Frank was an anti-immigrant activist.
Listen to the whole series right now, first on BBC Sounds.